All right. Can you hear me on the screen and here? Welcome to each one of you who has come to this workshop. We'll take just a minute to see who is all with us. First, we'll introduce ourselves. My name is Arlie Clausen. I am the chair of the board. We call it the moderator.
Is the mic on?
Is it not on?
Yes.
I am the moderator or the chair of the board for Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, which is one of the parts of Mennonite Church Canada. And through my work as the chair of the board at MCEC, Mennonite Church Eastern Canada, in the last 5 years that I have been chair of the board, we've dealt with about 8 sexual misconduct cases by ministers in that time period. Some quite big profiles, some very small within their congregation. So I come to this from experience as a board member, not as a staff person. But some of you may also know me that I am also a staff person with Mennonite World Conference. I am the coordinator of the regional representatives for MWC, and I have been a staff person for the last 10 years working in Canada. So that's who I am.
Good. Hi, I'm Doug Clausen. I am a staff person for Mennonite Church Canada, the executive minister for Mennonite Church Canada. So the way our denomination works in Canada is that the regions or the provinces or the districts, they are the ones who credential our pastors and ordain them and credential them. We don't do that at the nationwide level. But the nationwide level holds the policy, the misconduct policy that we have together with Mennonite Church USA. So when there's policy questions or things like that, then I get involved, but normally I don't. Or if there's a case where there's a complaint brought against a regional church leader, then I get involved too. But normally I'm not directly involved. At present, we are currently reworking our policy and expanding it to take away some of the lack of clarity in a few of the places, but that's a large project to work on.
So we want to share with you a little bit about how we work with the policy and with complaints of misconduct in Canada. And we hope that you can learn from it and apply it as to what will work in your own context, because each place is different and we want you to be able to figure that out. What we'd like to do now is find out who we all are here in the room. I think instead of passing the microphone to everyone in person, if you can just say your name and what country you're from, and I will repeat it into the microphone, and then we'll also see who is with us online. Yeah. So, who do we have in the room with us?
I am Max Wiegmann, living in France, working in Switzerland.
Max Wigner from France, living in Switzerland.
Living in France.
Oh, living in France, working in Switzerland. Got it.
80% for the Swiss Mennonite Mission and 1% for the video production, which is making transmission.
Yeah, I think that they will not hear it unless it is in the microphone. So then I will try and repeat what you say instead of passing the microphone around as much as I can.
Marianne
Marianne from France. I don't think I can pronounce her last name correctly. Welcome.
Keith Regier from Canada.
My husband, Keith Regier from Canada. And next.
My name is Reinhard Kummer from Austria.
Reinhard Kummer from Austria. Welcome.
I am Erlin Mali from Indonesia, from the eastern part of Indonesia.
And say your name again.
Erlin Mali.
Erlin Mali from Indonesia. Okay.
I'm Stephanie from Indonesia, but like the most eastern from her. I'm from Papua.
Okay, Stephanie from the very eastern part of Indonesia.
Yes, my name is Daniel from Jakarta. I work for the GKMR Synod here and then work as the human resource for the pastor as well. So,
Daniel?
thank you.
Daniel Trahanjo from Jakarta, Indonesia, and is part of the GKMI Synod here, leadership in GKMI Synod here. And then who do we have online? We can't hear.
Yes. 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 Hi. My name is Peter Post. I'm a Mennonite theologian and pastor in the Mennonite Church of Heerenveen in Challerbert in the province of Friesland, next to Witmarsum, Menno Simons. And well, that's my background. PhD in church hymns.
Thank you. And we did have before some, but I think at this point, this is all who is online with us, so welcome. One new person who has joined us. Can you tell us your name, and I guess you are from Indonesia?
Yeah, my name is Yudi from Indonesia.
Judy from Indonesia.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, good.
Sometimes when these questions of misconduct come up and they are dealt with, we often get asked the question of why are we doing this? Why do we have to upset everybody? Why are we going into these things? You know, can't we just deal with this quietly? Well, why do we do this? And I think there really truly is theological work that's behind this. And I often think that, you know, in the Christian life, we often talk about how we understand, you know, Jesus being at work in our individual lives, how Christ is calling us to discipleship and these things. We often speak about that. We also talk in our circles about how we see God at work in the world. And we talk about justice and mercy and areas of reconciliation in the world. And sometimes, at least in my mind, in my experience, we don't often think about how God is at work in the church. We sometimes talk about God as being, you know, a missional, inspiring mission in the church and these things. We don't often think about how God is working to clean up some things in the past. And I've wondered about this a lot, and I've come to the two chapters in the book of Revelation, Revelation 2, chapter 2 and chapter 3, where we have the message to the angel of the seven churches, the angels of the seven churches in Revelation. And I'll just read part of the first one here for us from Revelation chapter 2. I'll read the first 7 verses. To the angel of the church in Ephesus, write this. These are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance. I know that you cannot tolerate evildoers. You have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. I also know that you are enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name, and that you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned your first love. Remember then from what you have fallen. Repent and do the works you did at first. If not, I will come and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent. I'll just read that far. Sometimes at least in my thinking, I think sometimes Jesus is just rearranging things in heaven, waiting for us. But I think more and more now that Jesus is often speaking to the church, Christ is speaking to the church, and we're in a time now where we are being called to face some of the historic problems that have been going on in the church. And one of those is cases of abuse. And I really do believe, like the message to the seven churches here, I really do believe that we are in a time now where we're being called to account historically in the church for the things that have gone wrong over the years.
I also want to talk a little bit about changes in society, at least in Canadian society, that make it easier for people to talk about this. And sometimes maybe you've heard the expression, me too, where yes, I am also a victim of sexual misconduct, sexual abuse. We are starting to talk about church too, not just me too, but it's church too. So I want to give some examples of where there has been very public, just in the last year, talking about sexual misconduct in the church. The Southern Baptists in the United States have been having a convention just in the last few months, where a task force found that the victims have been silenced, and they asked for repentance and apology for their lack of response. They created a task force to make change and a database of pastors who have abused, so that they will not just go from one congregation to the next congregation to the next one. In France, there's a report from the Catholic Church that says that there are over 300,000 children who are victims of abuse from priests in the last 50 years. A horrific number, and that is just the children from priests. Then there is Ravi Zacharias, who is an internationally well-known evangelist. He died in 2020. An investigation the next year after his death found sexual misconduct and abuse with massage therapists in many countries, and hundreds of photos. And his board said, each of us bear a degree of responsibility for what we have been blind to, because we've not spoken against it and we've allowed it to continue. A story now in June from Mexico. Nason Joaquin Garcia is the leader of Mexico's largest evangelical church, called La Luz del Mundo. He was sentenced in June to more than 16 years in prison for sexually abusing young female followers in his church. Then there is Canada, my own country, where I live. The Meeting House, which is a Brethren in Christ church in Canada that is located very close to where I live. Roxy Casey was let go as the lead pastor a few months ago for sexual misconduct, and in June, the police charged him for sexual assault. And so those are just some of the big name stories, the ones that make the international news. But you know the news in your own region. You know that victims are speaking up and asking for justice. And so the stories that are the small stories in your own neighborhood are the ones that impact our congregations and our churches and trust. And so this kind of pastoral sexual misconduct happens in liberal churches, conservative churches, Catholic churches, Protestant churches, mainline churches, evangelical churches, and it happens in our churches, Mennonite and Anabaptist churches too.
This is where it gets a little difficult to describe or discuss what sexual misconduct is, because there are cultural variances as to how we understand things. So we'll speak primarily from a Canadian or Western setting, and it might be different depending on which country you're from. Just the way we look at the words, in Canada we call it, misconduct. It's like the word mistake. You made a mistake. The letters MIS say something went wrong. So misconduct means there's something about the conduct that's not right. That's how we see it. And then we talk about sexual misconduct. And that is a term that is used in how we manage people in organizations. Sometimes in Canada we call it human resources. I'm not a big fan of that term because it sees people as resources to be extracted, but in how we manage people, it's a technical term. Misconduct is a technical term that is used. And in sexual misconduct, we talk about it as someone where there is sexual activity between someone who is this person and their subordinates, or this person and someone who was lower than them, like a doctor and a patient, or like a teacher and a student, or like in a company, if there's an executive and a person who is working at a lower level job, those kind of things. So it's a misconduct that happens between people, and it's often written into the HR policies between people who don't share the same level of authority in their organizations. And sexual misconduct, again, it's defined differently. It can include anything from being suggestive to outright harassment or assault, things like that. There's a wide variety of definitions for it, and most church policy or other things will pick up and describe what those are. Most it's so it can include intercourse. It can also just include language, suggestive language. It can include touching, harassment. It can what it does is it exploits the trust. When people are working together, when a person is working for someone who is above them, they work in trust that the person will treat them well, and that it exploits that trust. It exploits the person's emotions. It exploits their knowledge. And sometimes, and I'll speak from the Canadian setting, sometimes when we get into pastoral circles, for example, and the pastor has had a sexual relationship with somebody from the congregation, there's often attempts to say, oh, but that was only an affair. That was just an extramarital affair, right? And that happens often with us. And we try to go back to say, the way we understand it and the way it's talked about in Canadian law is that a doctor and a patient, there's a sacred trust in between them, and a teacher and a student. There's a trust there. And we say the same for a pastor or clergy or a church leader or a conference leader and a person in the congregation. There's an imbalance of power that's happening there that we need to be attentive to. And the second thing we will hear is, and the person who is being accused will say, she tempted me. She tempted me. And so it was the way she dressed, or it was the things that she said to me, or she gave me a hug, or something like that. She tempted me. So she really started it, and I got drawn in. This is an excuse taken from one of the oldest stories in the Bible. It was actually right? You see blaming happening, right? Where we say in this position, the person who is responsible or who is in authority is always responsible. They're always the one. The doctor is always responsible for good conduct. The teacher is always responsible. And we say the pastor is too. And so I think, when I think about the temptation question, I often think about how Jesus handled temptation in Luke chapter 4. When he's driven to the wilderness and the devil comes to him with a stone, and he didn't turn it into bread and say to God later, I was tempted. Don't be afraid, I was tempted. No, he owned the fact that he was being tempted, and he resisted it himself 3 times. He did that. And so it's those two things that we often hear about. It was just an affair. No, it wasn't. It wasn't an affair. If it was with somebody, if it was one pastor in this church and a pastor in the other church, both of equal, maybe we could call that an affair. But when it's with a pastor and somebody within the congregation, that's different. Just like if it's a doctor and their patient, that's different, because there's a sacred trust there. And the second part is, we can't shift the blame away from the person who is entrusted with the relationship, the person in charge, and say, that person tempted me, so I can't be responsible for that. We don't believe you can do that. Just to see how, let's talk a little maybe we'll turn our chairs a little bit and we'll talk, how is sexual misconduct defined in your culture? How is it understood in your church circles? Is those two questions of, well, it was just an affair, do you deal with that too in your cultures? Or I was tempted, so I can't be responsible for that? Is that part of how it's been in your culture? Maybe we'll go in groups of 3 or so. Just turn your chairs aside. Peter, I'm not sure what to do with just one on the screen. Maybe you can share with us in a moment of it, but just turn your chairs in groups of 3 or.
I have an idea. Maybe there are 3 ladies. We can separate them.
Sure, let's get up and mix around maybe. Let's do that. We can mix around. And then we can just interact. So we'll take about 10 minutes to do this. We'll take about 10 minutes.
Some of the for the Indonesian language, also one group.
Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
Sure.
See how you can help.
Yeah, you go ahead. Yeah, just go ahead and arrange this. Yeah.
But for those who can speak English, also.
Yeah, very good.
It would be good to have them on and put them together.
Yes.
Mhm.
My knowledge would be correct.
Maybe just stay in the groups, but just turn your chairs facing this way, because we'll be discussing as groups again in just a minute. So just turn your chairs facing this way, and Arlene has a few more things to introduce here right now.
I guess if you want your paper and pencil to take notes, you might want to grab it, but I'll talk for about 5 or 10 minutes and then we'll go back into the small groups again. There are stories that we all have, many stories, and I hope that we can hear some of each other's stories and how we're working through this. But what I want to do now is talk about some of the distinctions or differences that we make in Canada and the United States about different kinds of sexual offenders. And this applies to pastors as much as it does to other kinds of professional people. And 2 words that we use are wanderers and predators. So let me explain those 2 words. A wanderer is someone who wanders. They're not following the straight path. They wander off the path. Maybe they didn't intend to wander off the path, but they saw their stars, so they went and looked at it. A wanderer is someone who gives into temptation, but didn't intend to. They found themselves in a vulnerable situation. Maybe they are feeling very emotionally needy themselves, and they are looking for someone who can help them in their own emotional needs. And they wander into a place where they didn't intend to go. And most sexual misconduct by ministers is wanderers. They don't intend to, but they get there. And so if there are very good prevention things that are put in place, it is easier to keep them on the right path and to prevent wandering. And so we want to talk a little bit today about what kind of prevention things we use in Canada to try and help keep pastors on the right path instead of doing misconduct, so that they won't wander into where there is temptation because where they are at. A predator is someone who is very intent on finding someone who they can have a sexual relationship with. They often choose people who are emotionally vulnerable themselves, people who are very in a weak place, people who might not be trusted by others if they say something. And so then the predator is someone who identifies someone who they could have a relationship with, a sexual relationship with, but someone who might not be believed by other people. And so they are a predator because they are looking for a victim. And then they nurture that victim over time until they have a relationship established that they can keep going for a long time. And it is much, much harder to stop or prevent a predator than it is to stop or prevent a wanderer. Predators are more often the very charismatic public people, like many of the people that I named before, who find a way to have a relationship that is quietly behind the scene to meet their own needs, because their own needs need to be met too. And so we talk about wanderers and predators, and there are different ways of setting processes or tools, boundaries within your church settings to address wanderers, which is most of them, and predators, which is only a few of them. But then there's another distinction I would like to make, and that is when it comes to children. Sexual offenses with children are often different, a different category as well than sexual offenses with adults. And when it comes to children, again, I would talk about two different types of sexual misconduct with children. One, again, is like the wanderer. It is the situation. I was in the car with a teenager and I couldn't manage myself, or some kind of situation, so that it is stray, it is moving across the boundary, but with a youth or a child. And so again, it's not intentional. It's not a long-term preference for children. It is the occasion, the situation that results in it. But then the second category with children is people who, adults, who prefer to have a sexual relationship with the child. And those ones, again, are much, much more difficult to stop, much more difficult to prevent, and takes a lot more long-term psychological work to be able to address the problem as to why it is that they prefer a sexual relationship with a child than with an adult. And so all these different categories help us to think through when there is sexual misconduct by a church leader. Is it wandering? Is it a predator? Is it with a child or a youth because the opportunity was there? Or is it someone who prefers sexual relationships with children? Because the response will be different in each case as to how you respond or how you deal with it. And the prevention is also different in each case as to how you work with it. So what we work at is good prevention, but then it's also good policy and accountability to prevent the predators and the ones who prefer children to address the harm that they do, which is multi-generations of harm within a congregation. The harm is not just to the person that they have had the relationship with. Because they are a pastor, a person in a position of trust, the harm is also done to the whole congregation. And so the question is, how do we think about addressing the harm with the individuals involved and also the harm that is done in the congregation or in the broader church by breaking trust? So those are all the different ways of thinking about different types of sexual misconduct. Doug.
So we've talked about already what is an affair and what is misconduct. We've talked about the temptation to blame, and even in cases where we say no, there's clear differences in authority. We've talked about wanderers and predators and situational cases with children, and by children in Canada we mean under 18. That's kind of how we under 18. So we would call a 17-year-old still a child by law in Canada. So, and then there's the pedophiles too, those who prefer children only, or mostly. What we do in Canada, we began developing some resources about this and understanding about this back in about 1992 already. And some congregations began to develop what we would call safe church policies. So how do you have a safe church? What is a safe church policy? So for example, when I moved to the congregation that I served in Alberta in Canada in 1998, I noticed that the Sunday school rooms had no windows in them. And so there was a window to the outside, like here, but all the walls and the door, there was no windows. And so I right away asked the maintenance people we need to put windows in those doors. So it was easily done. We had many persons in the church who worked in construction. So we found some windows and we cut holes in the doors and we put windows in the doors so that the Sunday school superintendent, who is in charge of Sunday school, can walk down the hallway and look in any room as to what's going on, and then we can help to make sure or try that nothing bad is happening. We also talked about having not just one teacher, but two teachers in the room. And sometimes that works where you have one person teaching, and then a younger adult, like a 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old helping out. So there's two adults in the room. We also,
John, before you go on, one question. So your office,
right,
did it have a window?
it did not. So my office did not have windows. My office had two doors that were both solid doors. And so I came in and I said right away to the guys who were in construction, I said, this office needs windows. And they said to me, we trust you. And I said, thank you for that. But I said, we need to safeguard everybody. So I insisted that we put windows in. I had two office doors, one to the reception area where the office administrator worked, and one to another hallway. I insisted that there was windows in each door.
And that is now how we work across Canada in the church.
Yeah.
That every door that closes must have a window.
Yes,
So there are no meeting rooms that do not have a window in the door.
exactly. Thank you for bringing that up. Another thing we do too is we're telling pastors that unless you are a trained counselor, unless you have a degree in counseling, you should not be doing counseling by yourself with somebody. So I've done theological education. I've taken one course in counseling. And so all I say when a person comes to talk to me, they say, I'd like to talk to you about a problem. And I'd say, sure, let's talk about it. And if it's a spiritual problem or things like that, then I can handle that. But if it's about an unhappy marriage or an emotional situation from that's happening now or in their past or things, I will tell them, I don't have enough training to be able to help you properly, but I can find someone for you to go and see. Or if they prefer that I still be part of it with them, I can bring a counselor in and the three of us can meet together. So that's how I do it, and that's how many are doing it now too. Another thing we do, and it's required under, I would say, ordination in Canada, and that is some regions are a little bit different, but every 3 or 4 years, the pastor has to go through what we call boundary training. Do you understand what I mean when I say boundary training? What it is, it's some instruction that is done by a person who specializes in misconduct, and they talk about, here's what you have to do to remain safe as a pastor. So for example, if you get a call and someone wants you to come over to if it's a male pastor, and a woman wants you to come over to their place late at night to discuss a big problem, do you go? Well, if the person is very traumatized, what happened to me is I phoned somebody else in the church, a deacon who was a woman, and I said, can you come with me and I'll meet you there? Then both of us will be there. And so I told the person on the phone, I will come, but I will bring somebody else with me. And that was okay, right? But it could have, I wouldn't go alone. Another thing I would do is whenever I would meet with a woman alone, I would do it during church office hours when there was our office administrator sitting just on the other side of the wall. I wouldn't meet with a woman by myself in the evening at church with nobody else there. I wouldn't do that. So boundary training includes those kinds of things. Another thing we do and we're working this into our new policy, is we're saying every pastor should have a spiritual director or a spiritual friend. Because pastors have many acquaintances, you talk to many, many people, and sometimes you would think that pastors have a lot of people that they talk about very deep spiritual things with, but many times they don't. And they hold the pain, the emotional pain inside, and we're asking that every pastor has, sometimes in Canada we have a thing called spiritual direction. It's like a counselor who helps you with spirituality. Not everybody can afford that. So we say, have a spiritual friend. Have another pastor or somebody that when you get together, you don't talk about everything in the news or sports or things. You talk about the deep things that are happening in your heart. And then you hold that confidential. You don't talk about it with others. You hold it confidential. Those are some of the things that we talk about and that we want to work with, try and help prevent. Let's take a few minutes. Okay.
One more thing, but
Okay.
Oh,
yes, right. One more thing that we do is all of our pastors are in a database. They're all in a database. And so for example, me, if I would be looked up in the database, it's called Meno data that we have. If I would be looked up, say for example, if Artie would look it up, and it's a restricted database, only conference ministers get to see it. If I'd be looked up, it would show that I began ministry in 1992 in one congregation. And then I went to a different congregation in 1995. And then in 1998, I went to another congregation and I stayed there 21 years. And then 3 years ago, I came into this role. So it gives my whole history of where I have worked. If there was a problem in one of those congregations, if there was a misconduct case or a charge or things like that, it would be in the database. So that when another congregation comes looking and say, hey, we need a new pastor, we should get this guy, then the conference minister can look in the database and say, oh, he pastored here, he pastored here, he pastored here. Oh, but wait a minute, there was a misconduct case. Now, maybe we can still work with it, but we have to be aware of that. And if we don't have a database, pastors can bounce around to all kinds of different churches, and they can leave victims here and victims there and victims there and victims there all around, right? So the database is a very helpful thing to have. Yes?
Who is responsible for this database?
The database, so ultimately it is me for Canada, and for Mennonite Church Canada, that's right. So the regional ministers or the provincial ministers are the ones who put all the information. They keep all of the data in there. So then, but ultimately it's held, the database is held between Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church United States, or USA. So.
It means pastors can't move from one congregation to another from one Mennonite congregation to another without somebody knowing what the history is. And if we go back to, I talked about the Southern Baptists in the United States, which is a very, very large denomination. They are very congregational. So each congregation makes their own decisions on who they're going to hire. And there was no way of knowing if a pastor had committed misconduct somewhere different. And so the challenge as a church leader, a denomination, is how can you maintain enough information to know what has happened and how it has been dealt with, and if there is space to move on or not. Okay.
So you've heard the prevention things. We put windows in doors. We have 2 adults when there was children. We have safe church policies. We have those things. Let's turn and talk in groups. Those of you who just come in a little bit late, that's totally fine. Form back into your groups and talk about what things that you think would be helpful in your culture. What would be helpful in your culture to do? So
for prevention.
For prevention, yeah, for prevention. I can fill you both in.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Peter.
Yes. I think I'm the only one without a mask. So I'm quite this is quite a safe house where I am. The story you told about someone who asked for you to come, and you said, well, I will take one with me. There is this question, isn't pastoral care in that situation based on mistrust, actually?
Sorry, can you say a little more? I'm not sure I quite got your question.
Well, if you take someone with you in a pastoral situation, isn't pastoral care then actually based on mistrust?
I look at it also, in this case, it was a woman who wanted to speak with me. I looked at it as also bringing another person along who could hear maybe differently than what I could. So I don't see it as mistrust. I just see it as trying to bring someone else along to help me, but then also just making sure when a person is in a vulnerable emotional state that things don't happen that everybody would regret later.
Okay. Yeah.
And I imagine that.
Thank you.
Drove separate.
Yes, that's true. We drove separately. We showed up in front of the house at the same time. Yes, that's right. We did. Okay, talk in your groups then about some prevention. What's some prevention things that you could do? Windows indoors, have 2 adults with children, those kind of things. Are there other things you can think about?
Okay, can we have your attention come back together again? Or maybe you can stay in your circles because we're going to come back together one more time. What I would like to talk about now is the policy or the process that we use in Mennonite Church Canada when there has been a complaint about sexual misconduct. So this is after prevention, after understanding. But when there is an official complaint, then how do we deal with it? We have a long policy with a lot of procedures. It is being upgraded, redone to make it better, and that is very good. But I want to explain the basic steps that we follow in Canada. They might not work for you, but this is what we are using as a basic outline of the steps. The first thing is that we make it known that complaints are welcome, so that people know that they can give a complaint. And we have found that sometimes it takes 20 or 30 years before people have the courage to make a complaint. And so yes, complaints are welcome. We have it on our website as to how to make a complaint. We make it known. And the more that we talk about misconduct, actually the more misconduct complaints we get, because people know that we can be trusted. So make it known that complaints are welcome and that confidentiality will be protected, because people will not share a complaint if they don't know that they will be protected about who they are. We are also saying that it does not need to be the victim that makes the complaint. Sometimes it's too hard for the victim to make the complaint. The Catholic Church has just changed, or a couple of years ago, their process that what we call a third-party complaint, a complaint made by someone else on behalf of the victim, is possible. We will listen to a third-party complaint. But when the investigation happens, the victim still needs to be ready to talk to the investigation. Without the victim being ready to talk, we can't collect evidence. So the victim needs time. It might take years of pastoral counseling before the victim is ready to talk. So that's the first step, is welcoming complaints. Once we receive a complaint, then we set up an external investigation team. It is not our staff. It is an external investigation team with people who have expertise in sexual misconduct. External means that they are more trusted rather than being biased from within our system, and they are people who have experience. So we set up an external investigation team. We have timelines and guidance about what they're supposed to do, but the external investigation team talks to the accused, talks to the victim, sorts out what has all happened, and they write a report with their findings. So then the third step is that those findings, a confidential report, those findings go to the committee that we have set up that is the same committee that decides when a pastor can be ordained. So it is the ordination committee or the credentialing committee or whatever you call it in your own group. We call it the leadership council. The same group that makes the decisions about ordination are the ones that get the report from the external investigation team. So I am the chair of the board at MCEC. I have never seen the report. I don't see the findings. I don't hear what goes to the decision-making group. I just make sure that the process is followed properly. So the committee, the leadership council, the ordination committee, they then look through the investigation team report and they decide what needs to happen. Maybe it is that nothing needs to happen and there is no misconduct. That happens sometimes. It is a complaint that there is no misconduct. It might be bad behavior, but it's not misconduct. Other times they find that there is misconduct, and then there's the question of discipline. And so is the discipline something that is a requirement of the pastor, or does it go beyond that and it becomes bigger? And the biggest discipline is that we take away the ordination of the pastor. That is a very big decision to make, and we have made that decision in MCEC several times over the last few years. But again, it is not public knowledge yet at this point. It's just the investigation team, and it's just the ordination committee that has seen the report. Then the next step is to think about the publication of findings. And the question is, what goes public? And we're going to keep working on the policy on this part to make sure that we have more clarity on what goes public and what doesn't go public. But we often talk about this person. How widely known are they? Where is their influence? If it is only within their congregation and there is a finding of misconduct, then their congregation should be told. And then there should be work done with the congregation. But if it is a person who has wider influence, someone who's known nationwide, someone who writes and is known across, then if it is a serious finding of misconduct, then we should tell the broader community so that there can be accountability and transparency about what is found. But in all cases, the identity of the victim is kept confidential and is not ever released in Canada. We never ever say who the victim was. All through this whole process, our intention, we're not always so good at it, but our intention is to make sure that there are pastoral and counseling supports put in place right away for the victim and the victim's family, for the accused, who then becomes the person who has the offender who has been found guilty, and for their family in terms of making sure that they have the supports that they need. And that is very difficult for that to come from us as the denomination, because we are the ones who are the ones doing the disciplining. And so it needs to be someone else when we say, okay, your job is to walk alongside and to provide pastoral care for both the offender and someone different for the victim. As I said before, we've been working with historical cases that are 20 or 30 years old. The complainant comes forward. Often when it is, well, for us, when it is a historical case, it is usually someone who is a very, very public figure. And that's why it has taken so long in many cases for the victim to come forward. We have been trying to work at how we work with historical cases. We believe it is important to address it because often the congregation or other people actually have known what's going on and it's just been ignored for a very long time. And so in order to bring healing, one needs to address it. But how to deal with historical cases well, particularly when the person might already be dead, is how do we do that well? And that is something that we are working on with the new policy as we go ahead. Then the last thing I want to say is that as Mennonites, at least Mennonites in North America, we have been very focused on victim-offender reconciliation. and trying to help bring about that kind of fairly quick reconciliation between the victim and offender. What we have been finding is that the offenders, when it has been named publicly, are very ready to meet with their victim and have reconciliation. But the victims are nowhere near ready to meet with their offender to talk about reconciliation. And we are trying to learn how to be more victim-focused or survivor-focused, and to say that it is the victim, the survivor, who gets to define the timing of reconciliation. It is not the offender's timing. It is on the timing of the victim or the survivor. And that could take a long time. And so we continue to work out, how do we help the offender over the long run? How do we help the victim over the long run? And how do we deal with the trauma healing that is needed in the congregation? And we're not very far, I think, yet. I'm trying to think about long-term healing in congregations or in the larger church from how this kind of offense has broken trust and caused harm. And that is where we have more work to do. So do you want to tell a story, or should we go back into talking?
I wonder if we should go back into talking and ask them maybe how it works in your own regions or your own denominations. If a person comes to you and says, this pastor has been abusing me, what do you do? Or what do you have in place? Do you have, our policy is like 20 pages long to deal with this. What systems do you have in place, or what systems do you need to have in place when something like that happens? Because oftentimes we find that a victim will carry this for so long, and then they will just tell somebody, and they don't know what to do with it. And then when they tell somebody who is an official person, we have to do something with it. We can't, as we say in English, we can't sit on it. We have to act on it. And so what happens in the Indonesian church when there's a complaint? What should happen? And what happens in some of the other ones? What happens there? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good. Let's go into our groups again and talk about what could happen.
Sure.
Okay, can we go back together again to summer? Finish our time together. Let's come back together again. We just have a few minutes left, and we've talked about defining sexual misconduct. We've talked about prevention of sexual misconduct, and we've talked about at least how we respond in Canada when there is a complaint of sexual misconduct. So we have maybe just 5 minutes left, but let's open it up for questions or comments that anyone from here might have. Maybe I will bring you the mic so it can be heard by other people. Any questions or comments? Questions that you have for us? Comments that you'd like to make from your experience before we bring our time together to a close? Daniel.
Thank you, Dr. Harry. And here in Indonesia is that I have a big with a difficult project, something like transparent structure. This is the first one. The second is actually when someone got the misconduct, so misconduct. Sometimes this victim is doesn't want to report, because this will make this person also say to other, even to the pastor, the other pastor. That is a second. And how to prevent that? I think most of us is believe we have to provide the sex education early for the early generation, so that, and then they can how to prevent when someone treat them like for the sexual misconduct. So that is the 3 points that we get.
Thank you. And we've only had a number of sexual misconduct cases come to us in the last 5 to 10 years. Before that, there were some, but there were not many. And I think what has happened is that the culture of Me Too and Church Too is making it more possible for victims to talk. And it is also, once we did 1 or 2 and people saw that we could be trusted, then it brings in more. And so I think it makes it really important that once you start dealing with a public case, how you deal with it is going to set the stage as to whether the next people are ready to talk or not. Because if they feel that the victim is being talked about in a negative way, or that the name is gotten out, or that different people are criticizing the victim, then the next victim will never tell their story. And so it's how you deal with it publicly is going to make the space as to whether or not more victims can come forward. Yeah, I also heard this group talking about sexual education, or just education of people so that they know what is a boundary and what does it mean to cross a boundary. And so that people know that when a boundary is crossed, that is wrong, and they need to find ways to identify it and stop it. Max?
Yeah. We used the term sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. At what point these two are different? How does one move to the other one?
Yeah. Sure, I think we often talk about misconduct as a technical term within a vocation. So sexual abuse would be a category of misconduct. And sexual harassment would be the same. Bullying, to pick up on non-sexual things, bullying would be misconduct. So we talk about misconduct as an overarching category, and there would be sexual abuse underneath that. It's one aspect of what's underneath misconduct in the Canadian society. That's how we would define it.
So if we go back to the example of Rexy Cady, the church did not define it as sexual misconduct. They defined it as an affair, which we find troublesome to begin with. Then the police charged Rexy Cady and called it sexual assault. So, all these different labels and terms, they mean different things to different people. In Mennonite Church Canada, we don't use the word affair. It's sexual misconduct. And it is very interesting if it goes to the police and then they call it sexual assault. That's another way of thinking about it. Any other question or comment before we go? Yes.
Thank you. I have questions actually. So you mentioned about the several steps that you have taken, during the investigations, and also mentioned about when the process arrived at the findings where, all the findings were submitted to the committee, and where you will find out whether the conduct was like sexual misconduct or it's just a problem of behavior. And my question is regarding the victims. So for example, because our culture, it's not, more victims are afraid because the people that are the one who is being bad is maybe someone that is very honorable in the society also, and also in the church. Then if after the findings, it is found out that it's not the sexual misconduct, but it's only behavior. So then it will go back to the victims, and maybe the victims will feel like, okay, this is like something, or maybe from the person who did the sexual misconduct, maybe found out that he was being reported by somebody from the congregation, and he will just think that the victims is maybe have jealousy or that something, so it may create another problems, but for the victims. So what do you think of that? Have you ever had experience like that?
That's true, and I think one of the ways that we try and address that is by being clear on our website about the definitions of sexual misconduct, and being clear about the process so that anybody who is thinking about making a complaint can understand and read what the policy is. And that means that, or their helpers can help them know exactly what the policy is and what the process will be. Which means that someone usually doesn't start it unless they're very serious about it. It does happen, but it's more rare. Like of the 8 cases that I worked with, 1 was unfounded and the rest were all found guilty. So, but trying to be as clear as possible so that the victim understands the definitions and how it will be used and how their confidentiality will be protected. It's also important that in the process, after the decision has been made by the ordination committee, and it is communicated to both the victim and the offender, there needs to be very clear communication about how the offender will relate to the victim. And there might be guidance or directions about no contact, or what can happen or what can't happen. Those are all the decisions that can be made by the ordination committee about what the discipline will include. But you're right, if you have a very honorable person, it is very difficult to figure out how to deal with that. I think our time is finished, and so Doug, can you?
Maybe one of the things that I will say just about the honorable person, one of the places that church leaders can show respect for everybody in the congregation is to have like a spiritual friend, and is to go for boundary training, and is to comply with all of the requirements to show that they are taking seriously the risks that are around. If they try to stay away from all those, then yeah, it's very difficult. But if they can show that they want to be operating in an honorable way, they will do those things, right? But yes, it is very tricky in some cultures when you have a very revered person. And then what do you do when things come out? It's difficult, even in the Canadian setting. Thank you, folks, for coming to this workshop. It's being recorded, and it will be available again. If there are some things that you missed or wanted to get clarification, or if you want to email either Arlie or me, Arlie you can find easily on the MWC website. Yeah, so you can contact us to ask for further information.
And you're on the Mennonite Church Canada website.
I'm on the Mennonite Church Canada website. We can send you our policies online for you to read. Yeah, we can send that to you and you can read it. It's being redone again, but you can see what we have for now, and we're happy to keep talking with you. So thank you for coming, and God bless you in your service.